recording. I hope that's working. Does anyone see the record
Yes.
indicator? Okay. My screen is displaying very strangely today, so sorry. Don't know why. Anyway, all right. Sorry, start over. So we're going to look at the historical context, what the Renaissance is all about and what it grew out of. And so I brought in some architecture just as an example because it really epitomizes these different styles that we're going to be talking about. Not that we have architecture we're going to talk about in the museum per se, or that it will be part of the rest of the lecture. I will be bringing in a little bit of sculpture, even though we don't have Renaissance or Baroque sculpture per se. I guess we might have one Baroque-ish piece or two. But this trio of images really, I think, explains kind of the major stylistic differences between the beginning and the roots and the source of the Renaissance, which was classical antiquity, the time that came between that origin of classical antiquity and the Renaissance. So it's a kind of a three-part continuum, which reveals a lot of really major changes and differences in attitude. And if you want to talk a little bit about the historical interpretation that we have had handed down to us because of the opinions of early writers, you'll hear this name quite a bit as we go through training. Giorgio Vasari, for instance, was a contemporary of Michelangelo. He was an artist who thought he was equal to Michelangelo. History has not treated him quite so kindly. But in addition to being an artist and an architect, he was kind of the first, if you will, art historian. He set about writing a history of art as he understood it from the Middle Ages through his own time. So he kind of encapsulated the period we came to call the Renaissance. And he gave us this flawed understanding of the sequence of things that really influenced scholarship and thinking about art for hundreds and hundreds of years. That classical antiquity was the epitome of art, that it was the finest accomplishment of humankind ever. And then art tumbled into this abyss of what is often called, you know, the medieval period, the Middle Ages. Often, in fact, it was called the Dark Ages, because there was this perception, totally biased perception during the Renaissance and after, that there was nothing of value that was done during this 1,000-year period that today we call the Middle Ages or medieval period. They literally saw it as a Dark Ages where civilization was almost extinguished. And that included not just the visual arts, but philosophy, science, everything. Of course, we know that to be utterly false now. But judging by their standards of the 16th century, that was how things were. There was this pinnacle. Humankind fell into this abyss of the Middle Ages and had to claw its way out and achieve a kind of a resurrection, if you will, of classical antiquity during the period called the Renaissance. In fact, the very term Renaissance is French and it means rebirth, as I'm sure all of you know. Rebirth of what? Well, this is one of the things you're going to need to learn for this section of class, is that when you do your oral reports, your training, when you do tours later on, you need a succinct 1 or 2 sentence definition of what the Renaissance was. That encompasses the philosophy of it and the time period and so on. And so that's a very crucial thing that you need to master as we go through this particular training. So if we look at this spread from classical antiquity on the left, which you can see is very orderly and sort of serene and sort um, very clean lines. And then you see the Middle Ages with this wonderful cathedral that we see and we appreciate today. They despised that in the Renaissance. They thought it was primitive and ugly, and it lacked, in their view, rationality, the ideal of the Greek world. And then you see on the right how they sort of tried to resurrect during the Renaissance some of the order and the clean lines and the simplicity of the classical work you see on the left. So this was sort of the overall arcing trajectory, if you will, of civilized thought during those time periods. And so the ages, the dates I give you here are rough and approximate. And of course, they don't apply everywhere equally, but in general, we date classical antiquity from about 710 BCE, which is before the Common Era, to 410. 410, why do we pick that date? Anyone know? That's the date of the fall of Rome. That was the date when Rome was captured by the Goths and sacked, and that was effectively the end of the Roman Empire, at least in the West. So then there ensued this roughly 1,000-year period that we call the Middle Ages or medieval, and it's succeeded by the Renaissance. So before we go on, are there any questions? Oh boy, I'm having, yes.
Do you want to define Renaissance for us so we have a basis to work
Yes.
from?
Yes, I will do that. Not on this particular slide. Now, I'm having troubles that I am very embarrassed about. My controls have all disappeared. There they are. Okay. So what is the Renaissance? What is being reborn? And in fact, it's kind of odd that we have a French term applying to something that was effectively Italian at the beginning. So in Italian, rebirth is rinascita. So it's still the same concept. Rebirth of what? Well, again, think in the mindset of the 15th, 16th century scholar, that culture crashed for 1,000 years and went into this dark ages, almost like lying dormant, like seeds or flower bulbs beneath the soil. And then with certain nurturing qualities, it was reborn roughly in the 14th century. And the thing about the Renaissance is that it was a rebirth of the notion that humans are central. And see, during the Middle Ages, because of the dominance of the Catholic Church, everything to do with God was made supreme, and everything to do with humans was subordinate to that. And so the idea was, in the developing period of the 14th century, this notion arose that, well, human activities really are important. In fact, this movement called humanism arose. And humanism was based on this certain idea that the study of human activities, the human mind, the human personality is very important and should not be relegated to the dustbin of history, if you will. And that, in fact, you can reconcile a deep belief in Christianity with a study of human activities and pursuits and human qualities and character. So it was an attempt really to sort of bring up the study of human things onto a sort of a par with the study of divine things, of sacred things. And so often there was a tension between those two things, because part and parcel of this rebirth of classical knowledge was a redirection of our attention to paganism. I mean, face it, classical world didn't have Christianity. It was in fact based on the pagan gods, from Greece with the Olympian gods and so forth. Um, and those kinds of things often came into conflict with the faith in Christian um, salvation, the whole idea behind the church. So there's a tension there that is very important for our understanding of the philosophy, but also of the art of this era. So if we're to define the Renaissance, what would we say? Well, it's a rebirth in the interests in classical antiquity, the focus on humanism or human pursuits and identities. The thing about Renaissance is that it has a different character in different places. So you're not going to cram all this stuff into your definition. In fact, I would suggest looking at the glossary or in the definitions, for instance, in your text of Gardner. There's probably a very succinct definition there. I'm going to give you the more nuanced, I hope, nuanced and broader definition in this little talk right here. So the idea is that the Renaissance manifests itself differently at different times and places. So if we look at the broad arc of things, it essentially starts in Florence, in Tuscany. Does everyone know where Tuscany in Italy is? And in fact, where the name comes from, it's a corruption of the Etruscan name. So it's where the Etruscan people lived in ancient Italy. And the Etruscans, of course, were predecessors of the Romans. They were a very advanced sort of group of people whose character was formed before the Romans rose to power in around 700, starting in 700. They were formed of native peoples and their cultural traits interacting with the Greek colonists who lived in Italy. And it was sort of the hybrid culture that grew out of that interaction that resulted in the Etruscans. So they lived in an area really roughly centered a little north of Rome, sweeping all the way up through Milan in that area, and then all the way down as far as Pompeii, Naples, in that area. It was quite a very extensive confederacy of cities that had a tremendous cultural impact on the development of Italy. And they laid the foundations really for what became Rome later on. So, and the Romans always had sort of this dual attitude toward the Etruscans of sort of reverence and respect, but at the same time sort of contempt. It was kind of a complex relationship historically, because in effect, the Romans conquered the Etruscans, wiped them out. I mean, virtually committed genocide against the Etruscans, but they learned a lot from them. And that was an important thing. So Etruscan is the name that becomes Tuscan or Tuscany, which is that region where Florence is located and up through, all the way up through Milan, really. And as I said, down as far as perhaps Naples. So the development of Tuscany as this cultural center was very important. And as I said, Florence really is the birthplace of what we know now as the Renaissance. But it didn't stay there. It spread to other cities, first in that region, and then it spread to other parts of Italy. And it got into Rome, and it went north to Milan and Venice, and eventually spread out of Italy. And so you have versions of the Renaissance adopted in France, in Germany, in the Netherlands, and it even gets to England after a while, but there's a huge time lag. So while we might talk about the Renaissance starting in Florence in, we roughly just say 1400, it really started earlier. You know, you're not going to see those same traits in Germany or England at that time. It took a century or two for the cultural ideas of the Renaissance to penetrate and to those other geographic areas. And even when it did penetrate, it was interpreted in a different way. So that's why we sort of separate our study of Renaissance into Italy and then the northern states, because they really had a different approach totally. So what we want to talk about is really sort of the way that the Renaissance developed. And the reason we've been staring at these two slides for a while I extemporized, was that it's really through literature first and foremost that the Renaissance got its start. And therefore it started quite long before the visual arts began to develop in the manner that we call the Renaissance. And it was through the resurrection of ancient texts where scholars went off into scriptoria at monasteries or libraries. They don't have libraries in those days like we have today, but repositories of manuscripts. And they started digging through these things that had been forgotten during the so-called Dark Ages. And they began resurrecting these scripts. And there were not that many people who could even read classical Latin or Greek. And so it involved, for instance, the resurrection of the teaching of those languages to scholars. People had, and mostly they were self-taught. They had to learn how to read ancient Greek and ancient Latin. And they began translating these manuscripts, and they began learning all sorts of things about science and philosophy and even medicine or the arts. And those things really began to reshape the culture of Europe. So many of these classical authors that had been thought to have been completely lost, like Cicero, for instance, we see here, this is an actual manuscript page from a version of Cicero's Orator. Excuse me. It was rediscovered and translated, and people began to read it. And a lot of these humanist scholars were in fact leaders of the time. In fact, the one who found the lost letters of Cicero was Coluccio Salutati, and he was the chancellor of Florence. So he was the high mucky-muck guy who was running the city of Florence, but he was also a humanist scholar. An important figure for our concerns was another scholar named Poggio Bracciolini, who found a text by the ancient Roman architect Vitruvius called De Architectura, which was a treatise on architectural principles of the Roman period. They had thought this text was lost. I mean, they knew it existed at one time because other authors referred to it. But if they don't actually have the text, they don't really know what the ancients felt about architecture. So this was rediscovered, and it was translated, and then translated into the vulgar language of the time, Italian. So remember that learned people of the period we're talking about, the 14th and early 15th centuries, they knew Latin. That all important writing was done in Latin. But this was the time when literature began to be written by people like Petrarch and Boccaccio and other, eventually Dante, and they begin to develop the Tuscan vernacular language, which grows out of Latin, but it's the language of the more common people. And so this is another important component of the development of the Renaissance, is this spreading of literacy. They certainly had nothing approaching universal literacy, but more and more people began to be able to read and write, and that was very important. The other thing to take out of this is that, and it applies to the visual arts, but it starts with literature. Scholars who began to be able to translate and read ancient texts weren't satisfied with that. They wanted to begin writing their own texts based on the style and format of the ancient texts that they were resurrecting. So for instance, I mentioned already Petrarch. He's a very good example. Well, his poetry emulated the ancient Latin poet Virgil. You probably all know about Virgil, right? With the Aeneid and all of that. So Petrarch said, okay, fine, we can translate Virgil, but we want to write new works in the same style and in the same quality as what Virgil wrote. Leonardo Bruni, who is often called the first modern historian, was heavily influenced by the writings of the Roman historian Plutarch. And I already mentioned the work of Vitruvius being discovered and translated. Well, one of the people most influenced by the work of Vitruvius was an artist. You probably have heard his name, and if you haven't, you'll encounter it when you read your Gardner text, was Leon Battista Alberti, who wrote several important treatises, first in Latin, and then he translated them into the vernacular Tuscan language. And his first one was called De Pictura. Can you all guess what that means? Pictura, painting. And the Italian version is Della Pittura. This was done in 1435 in Latin, 1436 in Italian. It was a treatise on painting, one of the first modern texts about how you paint. And he based it on writings that he had found in the ancient manuscripts. He followed that up in around 1450 with De Re-Edificatura Libri, 10 books on architecture, which he then translated into Italian. That is the one I mentioned a few minutes ago, that it was based on Vitruvius, the famous ancient architect who lived during the time of Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar, and who encapsulated in his treatise all the thinking about architecture that the Roman architects had at his time. And then he capped all of this off, Alberti capped this off with a work on sculpture called De Statua in around 1453. So this is really important because it lays the foundation for what's going to be the Renaissance. So let's talk about some other elements. Many of these humanist scholars that I talked about, and their aristocratic patrons, because you can't make a living as a scholar, certainly in those days and not much better today. You need a patron who's going to support you and pay for you to live. Many of these folks collected antiquities, things that were being dug up as they were digging wells or trenches or foundations for buildings. They would find old coins and gemstones and pottery and that sort of thing. And these things were highly desirable for these wealthy collectors and also for the scholars who were often attached to them. So for instance, here's one of the most remarkable gems that you see on the left. It's a cameo that dates from the era of the Emperor Augustus that you see on the left. And this was found around 1246 near Toulouse, France. It was dug up, it entered the antiquities market. It shows up again in Paris in 1533, so it was being sold and resold. But it was a very inspirational work because look at the beautiful, elegant relief carvings on that gem on the left. On the right, another example, a Portland vase, which is a glass vase that has several layers of glass, and it's carved. The glass is carved away like a cameo. So it's very much like this stone on the left, but it's glass. And it was found in the early first century. Sorry, it's from the early first century. And it was found in an excavation in a buried tomb close to Rome. It was found in 1582. So again, it entered a collection of one of these wealthy collectors, and it really inspired artists who saw it. And so this is an important component of the whole process of the rediscovery of antiquity, was the physical remains, not just the texts, the manuscripts, but it was the detritus, if you will, the burials in tombs, the lost objects that simply, fell out of someone's pocket, or a hoard of coins and jewelry that might have been buried during one of the barbarian invasions. These are all important. Also, the sculptural remains of buildings that had collapsed, and parts of them were buried. The friezes from the tops, the capitals of the columns, sarcophagi were very important. These are the stone-carved burial containers, if you will. All of those were in abundance throughout Italy, especially in Rome, of course, but even in Florence and other cities. And they were constantly being discovered and then emulated by artists of the time. And here's a good example of that. This is a work by a Dutch artist who happened to be living in Rome for a number of years. His name was Martin van Heemskerk. And he made this drawing of an actual sculpture garden owned by a man named Jacopo Galli. He did this in 1533. And it shows those kinds of fragments of buildings and broken statuary and a sarcophagus and all these things that these collectors gathered to themselves, and then they would put in their homes, in their gardens, in their courtyards. And artists would love to flock there, and then they would go and make sketches and drawings and so forth. In this case, it's kind of interesting. Keep your eye on that central tall statue. We're going to return to that in a moment. But so these sketchbooks survive, and they show that artists were looking to the past. They were looking at these newly discovered treasures from antiquity for inspiration in their own art. This is how they learned how the ancients treated the human body. I mean, look at this torso on the right of this image. You can see the musculature. And this is so very different from how the Middle Ages treated the human form, which was done more in a rote fashion, where you learned how to do art from your teacher, not by looking at the world around you. And so by sort of leapfrogging back over the medieval tradition to the ancient tradition, this is how the Renaissance artists learned to make their art more naturalistic and more effective, if you will, if you're looking at things from the point of view of realism and naturalism. Now, one of the traps we must not fall into is sort of denigrating medieval art because it doesn't have this naturalism. The point is, it's not that those artists in the Middle Ages couldn't do that. It's they didn't want to do it. Their patrons didn't want naturalism. They wanted the stylized symbolic art because it was serving God, and it was supposed to be symbolic of the other world, of heaven, of the saints, and so forth. So the point is, the whole idea is that it isn't that the medieval artists were less skillful. It's that their point of view was quite different. So here's an example of one of these works done by a Renaissance artist in the style of the ancients. And as you see, this is a little relief carving by Michelangelo called The Battle of the Lapis and Centaurs. And it's in marble, and it's done, as you see, in this historic date of 1492. Totally unrelated. But you can see, first of all, it's not finished like so many of Michelangelo's early works. But it shows this twisting, writhing group of human forms, which really would have been very differently handled by a medieval artist. And so by looking back at Roman relief carvings, especially sarcophagi, Michelangelo was able to sort of emulate and adopt the formulas, not just the human anatomy and poses, but also the composition with this complex intertwined group of figures of the classical artist. And so, for instance, this is a work done very young. Michelangelo was, I think, something of a prodigy, a precocious child. He had been apprenticed to the painter. We'll talk more about this when we get to Michelangelo and painting. Domenico Ghirlandaio, I don't know if you've heard of him, at the age of 13. And this is quite normal. You would normally, as a boy, you'd be apprenticed to some craftsman to learn the trade as early as 10 or 12, perhaps. And he was apprenticed at the age of 13 in 1488. And he was invited to live in the house of Lorenzo de' Medici, and we'll learn more about the Medicis, I'm sure, when Steve Treadgold gives his talk in a week or so, whenever it is. But the point is, here's this young kid living in this house, which was chock full of antiquities, because the Medici were, again, those wealthy collectors who bought up things that came on the market that were uncovered during excavations and so forth. So Michelangelo was able to study at close hand for long periods of time original Roman artworks that had been collected by the Medici. And so this unfinished relief, made when Michelangelo was 17 years old, was very much influenced by Roman sarcophagi. And just so here's an example. I made a little image of the Michelangelo at the top, but at the bottom you see the kind of sarcophagus that might have served to inspire Michelangelo in the making of this complex intertwining of the figures. This was very popular style of Roman sarcophagus from the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era. Some were battle scenes like the one you see here, the Bergsten sarcophagus. Others were mythological combats, maybe of the gods and giants or the Lapiths and the centaurs. So these are kind of important sources, again, for the Renaissance artists. Other things that served as sources for the Renaissance artists were, in fact, the very visible ruins of ancient Rome. It's hard to ignore the Colosseum or the Arch of Constantine. Although, by the way, the barbarians who captured Rome and occupied it for centuries, and then the later medieval Italians did their best to destroy these monuments because they used them as quarries for building materials. It was much easier to go pull stone off of the Colosseum to build your house or your farm building or your fence than it was to go to a quarry and get stone from the source. So that's why, one reason why some of these ruins are so in such bad condition. Also, they were knocked down to some extent by a series of important earthquakes that rattled the Rome area where things were knocked off of buildings. And things in the, the Forum of Rome, right? That sort of marketplace, gathering place, political gathering place, area of religious worship. That heart of Rome called the Forum was a very low-lying area. And over the centuries, with no strong civil government, Rome allowed silt and debris and dirt to flow down into the Forum. And you can see in this image, these monuments were partially buried by these deposits of earth. It looked kind of like a battleground or wasteland for a long, long time until the civil authorities were restored primarily under the papacy, and they began digging out this Forum and putting in new drainage systems and that sort of thing. So here you have, again, an artist from a workshop. This is the very workshop that Michelangelo apprenticed in at the beginning, of Domenico Ghirlandaio, who did this drawing of the Colosseum and the Arch of Constantine. And those are gathered now in a codex in the library. But this was done about 1490. So by looking at these ruins, the Italian artists learned a tremendous amount about ancient art. A good example of how this papacy issue worked was that Pope Nicholas V, who reigned in the 1450s, early 1450s, was very concerned about the preserving what remained of the ruins of ancient Rome. And he actually commissioned our friend, the architect, Leon Battista Alberti, to make a complete survey of all of the ancient ruins of the city of Rome. So Alberti went all over Rome, measuring and making an inventory, a list of these buildings. Also, the Florentine architect Filippo Brunelleschi, who is famous for having built the dome over Florence Cathedral. You may have all been familiar with that. And we'll talk a little more about him later. he made and studied, he studied and measured many of the Roman ruins, and he adopted the principles of Roman architecture, the use of the arch, the applied column, in his designs for buildings. So again, it had a practical result. It wasn't just ivory tower, oh, let's look at what the ancient Romans did, but it's let's look at the ancient Romans and then apply their principles of architecture. So that was another really important source. So here is that Arch of Constantine as it stands today, built in the 4th century. And it's on the edge of the Imperial Fora, near the Colosseum, and it's one of the most prominent remains of antiquity, and it was very, very often copied by Renaissance artists. I'm going to just show you a couple of examples. Here's a drawing by Giuliano da Sangallo, who was in fact an important Renaissance architect. He worked on the design for St. Peter's. And again, this drawing was collected together in a codex called the Codex Barberiano. He learned structural principles of the arch and the vaults and the dome from looking at ancient Roman structures. And he also copied the decorative details. Look at the column capitals and the other decorative details, the friezes on this arch that later he worked into his own designs of architecture. And then here's an example of how the Arch of Constantine was worked into a painting where it really has no place at all. I mean, it doesn't make any sense for this to be here, but it was the fashion, it was the style to incorporate classical elements in your paintings during this time. This is a work by the famous artist you probably all know from The Birth of Venus or Primavera, Sandro Botticelli. And it's one of the big friezes that's on the walls of the Sistine Chapel. We all think of the Sistine Chapel probably for the famous ceiling fresco by Michelangelo, which we'll talk about later. But the walls before that were painted with impressive frescoes by a whole series of artists, and Botticelli was one of them. Now, this is a story from the Old Testament, from the story of Moses and the Israelites, and it's the punishment of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. And so it's in Palestine. It's in the Holy Land. So what in heaven's name is this Roman arch from Rome, the Arch of Constantine, doing in this particular place? Well, it doesn't belong there, but it was used to give a kind of an air of authenticity and antiquity to this fresco. So this is kind of an example of what was going on. I mean, you have to realize classical architecture did not exist at the time of Moses. I mean, that's the whole point. It just didn't exist. Yes, classical monuments were later on built in the New Testament period when the Romans were occupying Jerusalem and Palestine, but no, it didn't exist at that time. So these kinds of things were borrowed and then implemented into paintings. Like, look at the little, we call these things pilasters, these vertical areas on the left and right, and then there's some in the center, and then the little friezes with the cherubs across the top. Even the gold patterning on the back panels of the wall, all of those things are lifted out of ancient Roman monuments that artists were studying. So again, we come back to Domenico Ghirlandaio. He was one of the artists whose workshop, he really was interested in bringing antiquity because it was all the rage at the time he was painting. His patrons wanted that in their paintings. He was very adept at it. So you can see a lot of these things, like those friezes of the little cherubs, come almost directly out of sarcophagi, these carved marble burial tombs. So where did all this start, really? Well, it starts as early as the 13th century. So when we talk about the Renaissance starting boom in the year 1400, that's just a convention of scholarship to have a convenient chronological point to talk about. but really there are intimations of classical revivals as early as, in fact, 800. The Emperor Charlemagne was very interested because he saw himself as the new Roman Caesar, although he was based in France and Germany. And so there was what some people call the mini Renaissance of 800. There was another mini Renaissance of the 11th century. And certainly in the 13th century, we begin to see some artists sort of resurrecting, looking back to antiquity for inspiration for their artworks. And one of these people was Niccolo Pisano, who carved this pulpit for the baptistry at Pisa Cathedral in about 1260. And if you look at the overall thing on the left, well, okay, that looks very medieval. It doesn't look particularly Renaissance at all. The trefoil arches between the columns and that sort of thing. But look at some of the panels, and particularly the one on the right, which is the Adoration of the Magi. And suddenly there's a kind of solemnity and solidity about the figures, which isn't at all medieval. It is very much looking back to the style that we see on ancient Roman relief carvings and sarcophagi, for instance. Sorry. And particularly in the drapery. Drapery means, of course, the clothing that we wear, and see the way the folds are handled and the voluminous quality of it. All of that is quite contrary to the usual prevailing Gothic style of the period of 1260. And it looks back to classical antiquity. So for instance, look at, on the right, we have the same image by Niccolo Pisano, but look at his source. Is probably this Roman sarcophagus, which we know was in Pisa in the Campo Santo. I think it's still there, of Phaedra and Hippolytus, which are, classical myths. And if you look at the woman sitting on the left, she's essentially the mirror image of the woman on the right by Niccolo Pisano. Sorry, losing my voice too early. So this is the way artists were treating Roman antiquities, as a kind of a source book where they would go and copy things, poses, compositions, and drapery and that sort of thing. I beg your pardon, I'm having some allergy issues this morning. Similarly, in painting, we see the techniques of Roman, and you have to remember, for the early part of the Renaissance, they had no examples of Roman wall painting at all. There were none surviving that they could see. So the classical Roman elements that we see in early Renaissance painting came from the artists looking at sculptures and then implementing those things in their paintings. And a classic example of that is Giotto. We have that wonderful Giotto pinnacle from an altarpiece, but his most great fame really comes from his fresco cycles, like the one at the Arena Chapel. And here you see one example of that, of Joachim taking refuge in the wilderness. This was done about 1305, as it says. And he learned about conveying the solidity of forms by looking at Roman sculpture. Now, I mean, look at the trees are silly. They're still very medieval. The rock formations aren't realistic. The scale of the whole thing is totally inaccurate. But it was in the human forms. Look at those voluminous robes. This is where Giotto really got his inspiration, by looking at Roman relief sculpture. And we call this, by the way, and you might as well get used to this term really early, because we're going to use it throughout Renaissance and Baroque. He's using here already something we call chiaroscuro. Chiaroscuro. Chiaro means light. We have the word clair. The name clair comes from that base, and it means light, clarity. Think of that. Oscuro means shadow, or obscurity is a similar word in English. So chiaroscuro means light and shadow. And this is something the Renaissance artists sort of learned by looking back at Roman manuscripts and such faint recordings of how Romans did two-dimensional visual art. And it's this use of light and shadow to give the volume to these cloaks that these men are wearing. And that is one of the key breakthroughs, if you will, of the Renaissance artists in conveying a kind of a realistic or naturalistic style to their work, is the ability to take a two-dimensional surface and by applying light and dark pigments, convey the sense of actual three-dimensionality on that two-dimensional surface. That's really, if you boil down the achievement of the Renaissance, that is probably the major one in the visual arts. The ability to turn a two-dimensional flat surface into an illusion of a three-dimensional figure or space. And that's what you see right here in this particular fresco. And I was mentioning a moment ago, some of this was learned by looking at manuscripts. Because I said there was no surviving Roman wall painting available to artists to look at until the early 16th century. But there were some manuscripts in libraries that they could look at. They were smaller scale, of course, but they did capture this light and shadow, this voluminous kind of work that the Romans had mastered centuries earlier. And this is a good example of it. It's a page from a book of the Gospels that had been owned by Charlemagne. In fact, I believe it was laid in his tomb with his body, and then it was his tomb was opened up later, and it was taken out. But this is the figure of St. Matthew, the author of one of the four Gospels, depicted. Of course, no one really knows what St. Matthew looked like. There were no surviving portraits. But whoever the artist was who did this has that sense of chiaroscuro that the Romans sort of resurrected, the Renaissance artists resurrected from the Roman sources. So you can see that very clearly here. And again, this was, I mentioned earlier, kind of a mini Renaissance of Charlemagne. This was made during that period. If you look at other works during that period that weren't influenced by the royal court of Charlemagne, they would have been in a Gothic, not even a Gothic, a pre-Gothic, a Romanesque style that was purely medieval, very flat and stylized, more influenced by Byzantine stylized art than by anything classical. So these lessons that that Giotto learned were then passed on to another generation in this figure of Masaccio. And he's one of the great figures. I don't like to get into all these terms. Some people call, Giotto the father or grandfather of the Renaissance, and Masaccio is the father of the Renaissance, and so on. Those terms are not terribly useful and sometimes can be very misleading. But Masaccio looked at the work of Giotto, he learned a lot from it, and then he took it even further. And so you can see the same thing with these robes of the apostles and the other figure of the messenger here. You can see that voluminous three-dimensional quality by the use of light and dark pigments to give the sense of roundness and form. And look at the hanging of the drapery, how realistic that looks. And this is something that Masaccio learned by looking at Giotto, but also by looking further back to the ancient Roman sources that we're talking about. So really, this sort of thing is very important for our understanding of Renaissance art. So while Giotto was kind of avant-garde by doing this sort of thing in the 14th century, and not everyone liked it. He was not universally admired. Some patrons preferred a more, I'll get to you in a minute, Bob. Some people preferred a more Gothic style. By the time of Masaccio, he was still cutting edge, but he was much more widely accepted and admired in his day than Giotto had been before him. But Giotto in the day of Masaccio was looked at on a pedestal. Giotto was sort of the epitome. And this again was partly due to this reverence for the resurrection of classical antiquity. Bob?
Thank you, Jim. I thought I wasn't interrupting you by raising my hand electronically, but thank you for taking it. Could you comment about the color? It looks so startlingly bright for, the period of time that you're talking about.
Well, that's a good point, and we'll learn it again with Michelangelo. You probably remember the dark, almost oppressive colors of the Sistine Chapel, and it looked very moody, and that's the way this fresco was for many, many years. Well, it turns out that's not the original way that they looked. That is the accumulation of smoke and grime. I mean, remember these churches were all lit with candles for centuries, and candles make smoke. And just even people exhaling, there's moisture and dust particles, and all of these things darkened over time. And so our original understanding of the color palettes of the Renaissance artists was completely false. And as these things have been scientifically cleaned, and I know it's somewhat controversial, there's a few scholars who say, oh my God, you've removed, original paint by Michelangelo or Masaccio. I think the majority of scholars who are reasonable and rational think, no, we've simply removed later touch-ups by artists who have replaced things that have chipped or fallen off, and we removed centuries of grime and candle smoke. And in fact, these artists of the Renaissance were great colorists. They did believe in very bright, vivid colors, because again, think of where these paintings are. They're in dark, dingy churches with small windows, and they're mostly going to be seen, not often will be seen in candlelight. So you don't want dark, murky colors. You want bright, vivid, bold colors. And so these colors, in fact, may startle us a little today, but I think they're really quite accurate for their time and really show the aesthetic sensibilities of the artists and patrons of the day. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much.
Very good. Excellent. Well, let's turn to sculpture just a little bit. I said we're going to talk a little about it because so much of this is important. And I wonder, let's see, is everyone dying for a break yet, or are we okay? I got about 3 pages left, and then we'll have a break, and then another lecture follows up. One of the most important, in fact, one of the reasons we date the start of the Italian Renaissance to 1400 is that there was this watershed event that happened in Florence. It was a competition to design the bronze doors for the Florence baptistry. And in our day and age in America, where we have, since separation of church and state, and the Constitution says we don't have endorsement and we don't have sponsorship or official religion. This is quite different from 15th century Italy. In 15th century Italy, the church and state were very much entwined together. And for instance, the baptistry of the Cathedral of Florence was decorated at the expense of the public treasury. So it wasn't just the church paying for it. And so when it came time to commission new beautiful bronze doors for the baptistry, it became a civic event. And they had a competition sponsored by the city where artists were asked to submit a sample panel, this quatrefoil panel on the left. Quatrefoil just means it has 4 lobes. Is one example of a design submitted for that competition. And there was a jury who was going to decide, okay, who had the best design, and whoever got awarded the contract would be the one who was judged to have the best design. So this, you can imagine, quite a public stir about all of this. And all of the leading architects, I'm sorry, all of the leading sculptors submitted designs for this competition. And the really important point here is that this was the winning design. Lorenzo Ghiberti was the sculptor. And he, the point of it is all the submissions had to be the same subject. So they're all sort of starting on a level playing field. And they all had to do the sacrifice of Isaac. And so what was absolutely stunning about Ghiberti's submission was this nude figure of Isaac on the right, which I've enlarged, because that is the first truly classical nude sculpture done in hundreds and hundreds of years in Europe. First of all, think about the whole Middle Ages period when the church was so very dominant, and there was this ban on nudity, because nudity in art would be insightful. It would cause lust and lasciviousness. And so very, very few nude figures were done, and certainly in a religious context during the whole of the Middle Ages. I mean, there's a few exceptions. Adam and Eve could be done nude, although usually with a fig leaf appropriately placed and so on. But the idea that suddenly you have Isaac in this startlingly classical nude with weight shift, even though he's kneeling, he's shifting his body. And look at that musculature and the classic profile of the face. This was a really breathtaking leap forward for the artists and the patrons and the public, really, for Florence in the year of 1402. And so many, many scholars from then on have said, so, oh, well, okay, the Renaissance begins in Florence in 1400, about 1400. So that's kind of what this is. It's kind of a touchstone for the Renaissance. And the classical nude male figure then develops from this point on and becomes much more ubiquitous. And interestingly, as opposed to the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, when the female nude becomes such an important part of art, to the point where, you know, many women, feminists and so forth, have complained about, you know, you have to be a nude figure to get into a museum if you're a woman. In other words, women artists are excluded, but if you're a painting of a nude woman, you can get into this museum, Metropolitan or whatever. So the point is, there's a kind of a shift where there's still a kind of a prudery in the early Renaissance about showing the female nude, but because again, think about it, the artists are male, the patrons are male, and think about the women nude would sort of incite lust, and so they still want to keep that sort of under wraps. So anyway, this is a good example sort of that figure. Well, other works begin to show not so much the nude anatomy, but the way the human body moves and acts. And these are all things that the Renaissance sculptors learned by looking at surviving fragments of ancient Roman sculpture. The idea that people don't just stand stock still like statues, like little tree trunks. If you think of some of the Gothic figures on the facades of Gothic cathedrals and how stiff they are, they're like little soldiers standing at attention. But the Renaissance artists, looking at nature for one, but also looking at Roman ancient sculpture, learned that humans don't stand that way normally. They have what's called weight shift, where they put all their weight on one leg and maybe loosen the other leg, like you see in this figure of St. Mark by Donatello. And the Italians have a word for that. It's called contrapposto. Contrapposto. It means you have opposing forces on the human skeleton. So if you have all your weight, like say Mark does, on your right leg, you loosen your left leg. Notice how the knee has dropped down. That means there's a connected shift in the rest of the skeleton. So your hips will tilt, and to offset that, so you don't fall over, your shoulders tilt the opposite way. Contrapposto, so they're contrasting poses of the parts of the body. So I didn't bring one in, but there are little artists' renderings of these they've drawn lines across the figures, and they'll show you how the hips are tilted towards the figure's left, down, and notice the shoulders go up the other way. So the right hip is lower, the right knee is lower, but the one on our right, his left, but his left shoulder, our right side, is lifted higher. And that's just how the human frame, the human skeleton adapts to this kind of pose. Also, there's a torsion in many times these figures on the 360-degree rotation of the figure. So in other words, they're not all just looking straight ahead. Their heads will turn. Sometimes part of their body turns. So these are important lessons, again, that these artists learned by looking at ancient sculptures. Similarly, I've already talked a little bit about this being adopted in painting, but by looking at ancient Roman sarcophagi and relief carvings, such as the one on the right, this sarcophagus with a garland depicting Theseus and Ariadne, those kinds of decorative elements of the garland can be seen, for instance, on the lower left. On the bottom here, can you see those little putti carrying garlands? So this is a Renaissance relief sculpture of a tomb of, in fact, one of those humanist scholars I talked about earlier, Leonardo Bruni. He was the Chancellor of Florence. And he was commemorated with this magnificent tomb by Bernardo Rossellino in the Church of Santa Croce. And so you can see even the flying figures here on the sarcophagus, the ones at the top, the cherubs, all of these are borrowed, if you will, from ancient Roman sources, including even the column capitals, the frieze here, and so forth. So this is how they sort of, if you will, cannibalized ancient art by taking elements and then recombining them in their own works. Again, some very famous works were inspired, were inspirations to famous artists, such as the Belvedere torso. Now, this is an ancient Roman sculpture dating to perhaps 150 BCE that was discovered in an excavation in about 1510. And we won't go into all the antecedents of that sculpture. It probably is a Roman copy of 150 of a much older sculpture, but that's not really going to affect our argument here. Well, artists such as Michelangelo went and looked at that because it was collected in the Belvedere courtyard of the Vatican Museum, which actually at the time was not even a museum, it was the Vatican Palace. It was collected into the Pope's art collection, and they were allowed, artists were allowed to go there and draw it. And so on the right, you see this drawing by Michelangelo based on that Belvedere torso. And what is that on the right? It's a study for the figure of Adam from the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. So you can see how an ancient sculpture found its way into this Renaissance iconic work inside the Sistine Chapel. Similarly, this is another ancient sculpture called the Apollo Belvedere, probably dating to the 1st century. Again, it's a Roman copy, probably of a Greek original. Again, that found its way into the Vatican papal collections. Well, here's on the right, a drawing by Michelangelo of a sketch of that torso. Now he's changed the arm, he's raised the arm up higher, but it's essentially based on the same torso. And of course, what's so important is that artists like Michelangelo could copy an ancient source, but not slavishly copy it. They could copy the essence, but make changes in it for their own use. Here's another very important work, the Laocoon, which is a Hellenistic sculpture that was uncovered in an excavation on land belonging to Giuliano della Rovere, who became Pope Julius II. And it was found out, not even in Rome, but in a little country place called Grottaferrata. He installed this sculpture in his Belvedere courtyard, the one I've already alluded to with those other sculptures. And again, artists flocked to it because it was such a revelation to see something so dramatic and so magnificent in terms of its composition and the human anatomy in it. And if you look at this example of an engraving based on a drawing by an artist probably none of us have ever heard of, Marco Dente della Ravenna, done in 1506, you can see how inspiring it was to artists. And so it was probably the most copied sculpture in all of the Renaissance period. Here's a drawing of the study of Laocoon by Baccio Bandinelli of about 1523. Excuse me. And it even came down to the fact that artists would make marble copies of the original Laocoon. So here's Baccio Bandinelli's marble copy of Laocoon done about 1506. Of course, one of the things the Renaissance artists hated was missing limbs. So if you find a Roman antique sculpture with arms broken off or legs, they couldn't resist the effort to replace those limbs. And so you see this sculpture on the right is complete. It even got to the point where patrons like the Pope would hire modern sculptors to carve replacement. And so you may have seen old images of the original Laocoon where they actually have limbs attached that were modern carved replicas of the missing limbs, because it just irked the heck out of them to have these beautiful, magnificent sculptures have pieces missing. Similarly, and I won't dwell too much, but there finally are examples of Roman frescoes, wall paintings from antiquity that begin to be discovered in the late 15th and into the 16th centuries. Classic example of that is from the buried palace fragments, the ruins of the famous Golden House of Nero. And I don't want to go into that too much, but basically Nero, you know, the famous fire that burned down much of Rome. And later people, well, even at the time, a lot of people blamed Nero for it. And they said that he set the fire because he wanted to have urban renewal. He wanted to clear out the slums of the center of Rome. And so this area was swept by fire. And so he seized the land right in the center of the main part of Rome. And he built for himself this magnificent, sprawling palace that came to be known as the Golden House, the Domus Aurea. Well, it was thought that that was all totally demolished and gone, but some workmen were working and they broke through and fell into this room or one of the adjacent rooms. And they, of course, had no lighting, but they brought down lamps and they looked and they saw these paintings and they thought they were in a cave. They didn't realize it was a buried room of an ancient palace. So they called it a grotto or cave. And so from that, these decorations became known as grotesques, from not in the sense we have grotesque today, but meaning that they're from the grotto, of the grotto. And so look at the little swags and the candelabras and the little faces and masks. Those are what we know as grotesques. And you'll see them all over the facade of our museum. If you walk through the doors, that is really one of the important things that comes out of the discovery of this surviving example of ancient Roman wall painting. But it becomes emulated and used by other painters. So look at these blue panels on the right and left of this painting by Pinturicchio. Those are grotesques that are based on what was found in the Golden House of Nero. Here's a whole loggia on the left, designed by Raphael and his workshop in the Vatican Palace. And the whole thing is decorated in the manner of the grotesques that were found in the Golden House of Nero. And an example on the right in more detail, this was the Loggetta, or the small loggia of Cardinal Bibbieno, again in the Vatican Palace, done by Raphael. And you can see those very same kinds of little figures, the masks, the mythological figures, the garlands, the birds, all of that comes out of the Golden House of Nero. And another of Raphael's great constructions, the unfinished Villa Madama, which has this kind of grotesque design all over the vaults and ceilings in Rome. And so now we come back to this Martin van Heemskerk, the antiquity drawing of this garden of a man named Jacopo Galli, who was an antiquarian. And I wanted to, remember I pointed out in true transition fashion, a compare and contrast fashion, I said, remember that center figure, we're going to return to it. What he's actually doing there is he's putting in a work that isn't even ancient, it's modern. That work in the center was a sculpture by Michelangelo, which you see on the right. But he's made it look like an antique sculpture. And this is, in fact, Michelangelo's youthful work called Bacchus. So Bacchus, of course, is the god of wine. He's the same as the Greek Dionysus. Notice he has grapes in his hair. He's holding a wine cup. He's accompanied by a little satyr who's eating grapes and so forth. But again, the classical contrapposto, the anatomy, all of this Michelangelo learned by studying ancient works. And so this work, of course, still survives, but it was captured and emulated in 1533 by this artist, Martin van Heemskerk. So it's kind of interesting that you begin to see even recycling. So Michelangelo was inspired by antiquity, and then Van Heemskerk was inspired by Michelangelo's inspiration from antiquity. So it gets handed down through generations. And I just want to finish with one more little point about how the Renaissance patron and the artist couldn't help themselves. They couldn't stand to have things from antiquity that were incomplete. So for instance, this iconic work, if any of you have been to Rome, I'm sure you've seen on their manhole covers, I don't know what the current political correct term for manhole covers is, on their mailboxes, many of the utilities, the emblem of the city of Rome is the she-wolf, and it's kind of a logo, and you see it everywhere. Well, that's because this bronze statue, which dated to about 500 BCE and was in fact an Etruscan bronze casting, was rediscovered in the Renaissance period, actually in the Middle Ages, but it became really important. Again, entered the papal-controlled civic art collection of the 15th century. And they just weren't happy with the fact that there's no Romulus and Remus with it. It's just the she-wolf. And you probably know the illusion of Romulus and Remus, who were the founders of the Rome, the city, and then by extension, the empire, were supposedly abandoned to die in the wilderness, but they were found and suckled by this she-wolf because they had a mythical destiny to found the city of Rome. And so they actually had an artist commissioned to sculpt little bronze figures of Romulus and Remus so they could be combined with this ancient Etruscan sculpture to complete the picture, because it really bothered them that there was no Romulus and Remus there. And so we think the little figures were done by Antonio Pallavolo, when Pope Sixtus IV had this bronze she-wolf moved from the Lateran Palace to the Capitoline Hill, which is where it is today in that Capitoline Museum. So that is it for this. We'll take a break. Any questions before we break? Raise your little blue hands or no, nobody? I bored you all to death and you want to go take a break.
So what about we come back 12 o'clock? It's 11:46, so we'll give Jim a little break.
Perfect. Get my voice back. I need some honey. Bob did raise a hand though. One last question.
Maybe it's preceding Steve's talk, but the wealth of Florence to do those like baptistry doors and all of the other construction, where did Florence get the wealth at the time of the 14th or 13th century?
Two sources. One was textiles. They became a fabric processing manufacturing center for all of Europe. Wool fabric, silk fabric. They bought the raw materials imported raw materials, manufactured cloth, and then sent it out and sold it. And they made a tremendous amount of money. The second way was through banking. At heart, the Medici were bankers. They used their money, they loaned it at usurious rates all over the place to the popes, to kings all over Europe. They had branches of their banks in other European capitals. They weren't the only ones. There were other very important banks. But through those two sources, and trade in general, but those were the main sources of Florence's wealth.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Have a good break.
Thank you, Jim.
Not boring.
Okay, we'll take a break. Everybody takes a break.
It's always amusing to watch during breaks, looking at empty rooms. Lots of empty rooms.
Yes. That was a wonderful lecture, Jim. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug.
That was good. I have a question.
Yes.
If, you know, in this day and age of taking away, trying to restore things, I remember the Lawakoan having a hand up here at one time, but they've kept those Poliwolo figures under the she-wolf. Is there any particular reason for that? I know I've seen those figures on old coins, like old Roman coins, but.
Yeah. Certain things become so iconic that to tamper with them would probably cause a riot. I don't know.
No, that makes sense.
I mean, my guess is that's almost more of a political monument now than an art monument. So I'm just guessing that's probably why they haven't. And I mean, the other thing is they're not, I mean, they're easily removable. They're not like part of the body. But yeah, I mean, they've gone through, you probably have seen it all over Europe. Even the classical Greek works that are in Germany were fully restored in the 19th century. And sometimes using a lot of imagination. They didn't know what really was there, so they just carved whatever they thought. And that's with the Laocoon, because they realized from the musculature of what was left, the arm couldn't have been raised like that. It had to be bent. So that's why the newer version had it bent.
Yeah. Is that it? I thought that was an original. Don't ask me why.
No, it was, but the joint was missing or something. So they couldn't attach, they didn't know how to attach it. So they created, you know, a made up kind of a joint and connection. So yeah, there's a whole new aesthetic about, like, even Greek pottery. Like if you have a broken vase and there's a piece missing, the old way used to be to replace it and then have an artist paint in what they thought was missing, or, you know, whatever. Now they will put in a slightly different colored piece to say, you know, fill in the gap, but make it clear it's not part of the original. So I think that's a more, you know, a more honest approach. And whatever they do nowadays has to be reversible really easily, because you don't want to cause problem. But those 19th century, they would hire these sculptors to replace stuff, and then that would be like, you know, they put a iron joint rebar thing in it, and it's like, oh my gosh, it started rusting, and then it became hard to remove it. And, you know, they didn't know enough scientifically the consequences of what they were doing. So let's hope that's at least hopefully one era where we've grown a little.
Thank you.
I'm going to take a throat lozenge. Hope that'll help, but I hope I don't choke on it either. It's like you get talking and you swallow the whole throat lozenge. That's not a good thing.
No.
Jenna, did your knee recover? I think you're on mute.
Yes, thank you.
Oh,
Yeah, okay.
so you're good as new. You're back on the walks.
Walking trail, yeah.
That was a beautiful flower arrangement you had in your absence. Was that a gift or?
It was an anniversary gift, so
Beautiful.
it looks better than my face, so whenever I can put it up there.
No. Well, then you take a picture of it, cut out eye holes, and wear it as a mask, and then
Sounds good.
no, sounds rude, but that's okay.
How's Elvis, Bob?
You're on mute.
Muted, Bob. Muted,
muted.
muted.
Where's your puppy?
Right, he's there.
Do you want to see him?
We
Yeah.
want Elvis. We want Elvis.
Yeah, well, wherever I go now, that's the thing.
He follows you around like a puppy dog?
No, people greet him more than they greet me. Can you see him?
Uh,
What kind is he, Bob?
He's a Labradoodle. Do you see him?
Yes, he's
Yes.
adorable.
Oh, yeah, he's so cute.
Yeah, so he's been groomed. He feels like chenille or velour. It's so soft.
How old is he?
He's 17 weeks.
We can keep the musical theme, and we'll call him the Captain and Chenille.
Yeah.
Yes.
Ooh, ooh.
I know that was bad. Sorry.
It was a groaner.
My favorite kind of humor is groaners. The clock is ticking. I guess we'll start without the absentees. I don't want to hold it up. There's Allie. All right, let me get this show on the road. I hope I got this right. So is everybody seeing this thing?
Yes, see the introduction.
Yay. Now, don't judge me. This was done a couple of years ago, so it isn't up to current standards. So those of you who are, I'm really talking to Allie. Don't judge the quality of this. Basically, this introduction to Italian Renaissance art is a complementary work with the classical sources PowerPoint we just looked at. This will give you a more detailed introduction to the concepts, the chronology, and the major developments, the major artists of this period, this very important period. But just be aware, looking at your syllabus, that there will be more specific talks by other docents covering Florence, Venice, I think Counter-Reformation, Mannerism, that sort of thing. So this is, again, sort of just an overview. And I distinctly stayed away from SDNA works with the idea that we're going to cover those in class. So I'm trying to, this is kind of like condensed Gardner's approach to the Renaissance, that's narrated by me. So first, let's take a look at the map and what we're talking about, the Renaissance in Italy. And the key thing to know, I'm not going to read all the stuff on the right. I figure all of you know how to read if you've gotten this far in life. And much of it would, in fact, replicate what I just talked about in the previous PowerPoint. But the thing about the map that's important is, look how fragmented Italy was. We all think of Italy as a unified state. Well, that didn't happen until 1870. And until that, for centuries and centuries, since the fall of Rome, really, Italy was fragmented into these various territories and possessions. Some of them were owned by foreigners who had conquered them or inherited them. The French, the Germans were in there. There was even a time when Muslims from North Africa conquered, Sicily and part of southern Italy. There was the Byzantine Empire from the east that conquered parts of it and ruled, around Ravenna, for instance, and parts of that. The Pope, the papacy, I should say, because there were many different popes succeeding one another, controlled large swaths. You can see that papal states in there. There were petty lords and so forth who ruled certain territories. Other parts were republics. So it was a kind of a patchwork quilt. And as you can imagine, with that kind of a diverse political setup, there was often conflict and wars. In fact, the history of Italy during this period is more full of wars than, well, I don't know. I can think of a lot of places that were full of wars. Germany had a similar history, really. If you think about Germany today, we're thinking of this sort of, big unified country. But, all through the Middle Ages, after the fall of the Holy Roman Empire, it was all fragmented into these little states as well. So keep that in mind as we go forward. Because it does affect the interest in art, the way art develops and that sort of thing. Let's talk about the chronology too, because some of this will come up. You'll see it in readings. We have really two concepts to grasp. One is the overall chronological breakdown. It's kind of an old-fashioned term, but I still like it. The Proto-Renaissance is the time leading up to 1400. That time I talked about in the previous PowerPoint, where some artists were experimenting. This is the time of Giotto. They were experimenting with this sort of classical revival with the use of things that brought more naturalism and realism into art. The early Renaissance, roughly a century. Again, these are very elastic dates, but just for the convenience of conversation, we sort of have to peg time periods. It's not to say a Renaissance work in the early style didn't get made in 1505, because some of them did. Not to say something made in a Renaissance style didn't happen before 1400, but these are just general categories. So again, part of this is formed by Vasari and scholars who came after him, this idea of an early, a high, and a late. And a lot of scholars are trying to shy away from this now because it implies a quality. In other words, the high Renaissance sounds better than the early Renaissance. You know, and many people have used that sort of metaphor as that, oh, accomplishment in art achieved a pinnacle during the high Renaissance. So the early Renaissance led up to it. But really, we shouldn't have that attitude. We really need to judge each period's work, each artist's work, on its own merits, and just as we shouldn't downgrade medieval art and say, oh, it's inferior to the Renaissance, we shouldn't downgrade any art of any of these periods, because all of these things had their own purpose, their own inspiration, and so forth. Some people have always said, oh, well, the late Renaissance is a decadent period. You know, it was just the Renaissance was unwinding, and it wasn't as, the accomplishments weren't as great as they were in the high Renaissance. And then mannerism, a lot of people just dismiss, oh, that was bizarre. I mean, that was just, artists were going crazy during that period. So, and notice mannerism is a phase of late Renaissance. Really the two coexist because the dates are essentially the same. But specialized terminology that art historians and historians in general, I guess, have for this is derived from the Italian. The 13th century is called the Duecento, or sometimes it's Dugento with a G, Dugento, Duecento. Simply means 200s. Well, it isn't 200s, it's 1200s. So whoever devised this over time, they kind of dropped the thousands off and they just count the later part of that number. So, so that essentially is part of the Proto-Renaissance. Duecento, and the Trecento is also part of the Proto-Renaissance. Trecento means 300s, and it's short for 1300, and it means the 14th century. So really the core of the true Renaissance is the Quattrocento, the 400s, which is short for 1400s, or 15th century. This gets very confusing, folks. So our chronologies can be difficult because when we say 15th century, a lot of people immediately want to say, oh, that's the 1500s. No, it's the 1400s. So just get used to that when you're referring to it. And finally, the Cinquecento. I'm not going to go into the Seicento, which is the 17th century, but it's all based on Italian counting systems. Is that everyone clear on that? That's pretty straightforward. Let's talk a little bit about some of the factors that influenced the development of the Italian Renaissance. And one of them, and very important one, is the patronage. Art was commissioned by patrons. There was really no art market. And we all, from a modern perspective, think of, oh, an artist does what they want to do, and then they try and sell it if someone will buy it. And occasionally there might be commissions, you know, a city commission, a corporate commission, but the bulk of art is done on speculation just because the artist is interested in it. That is not the way it was in the Renaissance. 99% of art was commissioned by patrons. And we'll talk about who those patrons were later. I'll give you the hint. The biggest patron of all probably was the church. Not just the papacy, but the local churches in all of the towns and dioceses all over. Another really important factor is the guilds. Again, artists were not as free to do what they wanted in those days as they are today, or have been really since the 19th century. There was a very strict guild system, not just in art, but in all industries. There was a pharmacist guild, a bankers guild, a wool makers guild. I mean, there were guilds governing just about every kind of industry or human activity. And the guilds were associations that protected the people, the workers in that field to some extent, but they also dictated rules, how you got qualified to become a member of that working group. Apprenticeships, then you become a journeyman and a master. So you didn't just decide one morning, I want to be an artist, and you go out and set up a studio. Generally, you had to be apprenticed at a very young age and work your way up from the bottom. Apprentices would leave their families. They would go live in the household of the artist they were apprenticed to. And they would start out sweeping the floor, doing all the menial work. Then they might be, if they had any aptitude at all, be given the job of mixing pigments, for instance, or making brushes, or doing some simpler things, preparing the wooden panels for painting. Then if they had some talent, they would, you know, and all along they would probably be given drawing lessons and that sort of thing. And then they would be given small tasks. Okay, you paint the background of this painting while the master paints the big main part. So it was a system of working up from the ground level. The dominant thing in all of this practice was tradition. Remember, I talked about how Giotto and then Masaccio and others begin to break with just doing what their teacher told them. But that was a long, arduous task to break with tradition. For 1,000 years or more, the tradition was you paint the way you're taught to paint. If you want to paint a face, this is the way you do it. If you want to paint a hand, this is the way you do it. You don't look at a hand, you do it the way your teacher taught you to. So it's a hand-me-down kind of system. But it was also a time of innovation where people tried new things. That was how art grew during that period. So innovation is another element that's really important. And of course, the overriding one that sort of really affects the whole thing is this notion of humanism that I outlined earlier. The idea that the divine, the sacred, they're not discarding it, but they're kind of, in a sense, equalizing the human with the divine. And they're saying not that man is terribly inferior to God, but he's made in God's image, and therefore the man is a proper study of humankind. So I just brought these little sculptures in. Again, they're by Andrea Pisano, and they're from the Campanile of Florence Cathedral. But I brought them in because they depict the three major arts, sculpture in the middle, painting on the left, and building or architecture on the right. So let's talk a little bit about patronage. What's the major patron of the period? Well, the Catholic Church. And remember, this is certainly until 1519, the Catholic Church is the only game in town. There is no Protestant church. And that can be the papacy, you know, based in Rome, except for the Avignon banishment, if you will. But it includes the whole papal court. So the cardinals, all the bishops, and so forth. It also includes the religious orders, Franciscans, Dominicans, all of these different orders had their own monasteries, their own churches, and they commissioned works. Confraternities, which are non-religious, meaning lay people, they're associations of lay people who do certain things to support charity or support the church. And they often would have oratories or churches or chapels, and they would commission artworks. And of course, the parish churches. And so this is the fountainhead of so much artistic commission. Then there's also rulers. There's the nobility, the dukes, the princes, the kings, but also civic governments. So again, when you get to a republic like Florence or Venice or any of the other republics, they often will commission works of art themselves. Then there's also the rising wealthy classes, not aristocrats necessarily, but the merchants and bankers who become very wealthy, and they want to show their status and taste by commissioning works of art. And then finally, the guilds themselves. Not just the artist guilds commission artworks, but other guilds commission artworks as well, as we'll see in a moment. In fact, one of the examples is this image on the lower left by Noni di Banco, which is a relief showing stone carvers. And it decorates a building that was sort of a chapel, but all of the guilds of Florence contributed to the artistic decoration of that building. Each of the guilds commissioned certain works to be displayed on that building. You remember the St. Mark sculpture by Donatello I showed you last time was one of the sculptures commissioned for that work, for that building. So this is kind of an important fact to master, is the patronage. So now let's talk a little bit about the different media that become really important. Of course, really the king of all the media is painting. It was always the most highly regarded, although certainly not the most expensive necessarily, but in painting you can get painted panels, and that's the way it certainly started, because as a tradition inherited from the Byzantine East and from the medieval European tradition, you painted on wooden panels. That was just what you did. A secondary one would be, of course, fresco painting on walls. Starting out in the Italian Renaissance, it was tempera paint on wooden panels. Tempera being a mixture of egg yolk with a little water and then pigment. And that gives a certain quality to the pigments that you're using, but it also has certain limitations. We'll talk more about that later. Then gradually canvas gets introduced, and it seems to have come from Northern Europe and then gotten into Italy, just like oil painting started in the Netherlands and then made its way into Italy. So after all the painted media, sculpture comes next. Now, Michelangelo essentially always saw himself as a sculptor. I know we all seem to think, oh my God, he did the Sistine Chapel ceiling. He must be, the greatest painter of all time. Well, he did it reluctantly, and he never really saw himself as a painter per se. He always felt he was a sculptor at heart. And in his mind, sculpture was the premier visual media. Sculpture has really two types: relief, which I have an example of on the bottom, and then in the round, or fully three-dimensional. And then, of course, there's architecture. Subsidiary to that, and it wasn't really a major medium, mostly used as copying, would be the print media, like engraving, for instance. We're not going to really get into that because it wasn't terribly important. We saw a few engravings in our introductory lecture earlier. And of course, drawing wasn't seen as an independent form of art. All these artists did drawings, preparatory drawings, studies, to prepare to make what they saw as the ultimate work of art, a painting or a sculpture. So drawing was important, but it was never, ever, ever valued really as an independent work. You wouldn't set out to make a drawing as a finished work of art. So let's jump right in and talk. We'll just do kind of a survey of these different eras and the artistic qualities. The Duecento or Dugento is dominated by something the Italians called the maniera greca, the Greek style, sorry. And why is it called the Greek style? Well, because it was dominated by Byzantine art from the East, and not just from Greece, but from what we call today Turkey, the heartland of the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople. Well, in the Italian mind, all that stuff over there was Greek, because Anatolia, Turkey, were all derived from the Greek colonies of the ancient era. And that, when the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 410, for another 1,000 years, the Roman Empire continued in the East, in Greece, the Balkans, and in Turkey, even into Egypt for much of that time. It continued with this style that we call Byzantine. Where does Byzantine come from? The capital of that area was called Byzantium. And so the word Byzantine arises. And so, in fact, there's a schism where the Western Latin Church and the Eastern Greek-dominated Byzantine Church breaks away. And that's why we call it Byzantine Church. Sometimes it's called Greek Orthodox. And there's segments and sects of that. But that's why the Italians considered all this stuff Greek. And so it's very medieval looking. I mean, look at, I was talking about statues standing stiffly. Look at the St. Francis on this panel on the right. This altarpiece done in 1235, Bonaventura Berlinghieri. He's an Italian, but he's painting the Byzantine style. Flat. Any attempt at making folds in the drapery become these stylized striations. There's nothing looking three-dimensional about that. The attempts at shadowing on the face become almost mask-like, symbolic shadowing that doesn't look realistic because it's stylized. It's all stylized. If everyone could please mute, there's some sounds going on that are kind of distracting. So if you aren't muted, please mute. So you see then the qualities then of this maniera greca. And that was what dominated Italian art at the 13th and into the 14th century. Look at the landscape on the left, which is a detail of the St. Francis preaching to the birds from the panel on the right. Is that a convincing landscape? Is that a hill or a mountain? Look at those funny little trees and the bird. And look at the building behind, which really is way too small for the figures that are standing in front of it. So this is the quality that we're setting as the background for the development of Renaissance art. So this is the Duecento. Now remember, we talked about the rise of a proto-Renaissance in the Duecento, and we already sort of talked about this early blossoming in the 13th century of an emulation of Roman style. We looked at a different version in the first lecture today. Here's another work by Niccolo Pisano from the pulpit of Pisa Baptistry. This one shows the Annunciation and the Adoration of the Shepherds. Again, look at that Mary reclining after the Nativity. The serving maids are bathing the infant Christ. Well, of course, Mary didn't have serving maids. She was a poor woman who gave birth in a stable. But they're following a tradition from medieval art of Mary, of all birthing scenes. Mary herself is shown being born and then bathed in a basin by serving maids or relatives of the family. But one of the things you notice here is there's still this remnant of a hierarchy of scale, where Mary is this gigantic figure, and then all the other figures in the foreground and the background are smaller because they're less important. And there's also this combination of different moments of the story. See how the Annunciation is in the upper left? And then there's the Adoration of the Shepherds in the upper right. So there's really 3 stories crammed into one panel. And this is quite typical. It comes from the Middle Ages, but it goes right on in. We saw it with Masaccio, by the way. I didn't point it out at the time. Remember the tribute money I showed you before? I think we'll probably see it again. But there's 3 different moments in the same story occupying the same physical space. Again, remember I was all waxing poetic about Ghiberti's nude male figure? Here was one exception where Niccolo Pisano, remember in this little burst of classicism in the 13th century, he carved this figure of a metaphorical figure, a personification, if you will, of fortitude, and he is a sort of heroic classical nude on the Pisa Baptistry pulpit. Again, more of the Proto-Renaissance, and I wanted to point out, this is really important, sorry, that classical strain of Proto-Renaissance art is by no means the major current. There was still a very Gothic and Byzantine strain that really dominated. And so an example of that is this giant altarpiece. Have any of you seen this in Florence? It's just this gigantic, I don't know, it's 9 feet tall or something, by Cimabue, the Madonna Enthroned. And look how very very Byzantine the upper part is. The use of gold, the striations in the drapery, there's very little sense of 3-dimensionality. But in the base, if you will, where these prophets are located sort of under the throne of Mary, we begin to get little hints that even a very traditional backward sort of artist like Cimabue, and I don't mean backward in like he's slow-witted or anything. I just mean he's backward-looking. He's looking at tradition. There's little attempts to show 3-dimensionality here. So this is a good example of how multiple currents conflicting in aesthetics can exist at the same time. And then another strange little burst of classical style comes out in Rome in a work by Pietro Cavallini during the Duecento, in this marvelous fresco in the Church of Santa Cecilia in Trastevere. I don't know if any of you have been there. It's across the Tiber from the main part of Rome in the area called Trastevere. Trastevere simply means across the Tiber. And it's this little church of Santa Cecilia where for a long time these frescoes were covered, and then they found them and cleaned them and whatever. And look at these wonderful apostles on the left, where you get that solidity like Giotto. But this is before Giotto, at least before the ones we looked at before in the first lecture. Look at the toga-like garments and the folds of drapery and the chiaroscuro. These look like 3-dimensional figures, even the little benches that they're sitting on. So again, this is just a different current that is running sort of parallel to really the Niccolo Pisano sculptural current. The idea of looking to the past beyond the Middle Ages back to classical antiquity for inspiration. Now we get to the Trecento, which is still the Proto-Renaissance, but this is when things really start to liven up, when Giotto comes on the scene. And one of his most famous fresco cycles, there are a number of them in fact, but one of the most famous and inspirational is the Arena Chapel, the Scrovegni Chapel. And it's called the Arena Chapel, by the way, because it was painted in well, the chapel was built in the ruins of an ancient Roman arena in the town of Padua. And so its true name is the patron who paid for the chapel, whose name Scrovegni, but everyone has trouble pronouncing that and they prefer to say Arena Chapel. he commissioned Giotto to paint the inside of this chapel with this marvelous series of frescoes on the life of the Virgin and the life of Jesus. We've just simply pulled out one of the most famous, which is the Lamentation on the left, which shows how Giotto learned the lessons that Cavallini had already learned, and that really looked back to ancient Roman sources of showing voluminous figures on a two-dimensional surface by manipulating light and shadow, light and dark pigments. And just the genius of the man. I mean, look at how he has this woman in green sitting with her back to us in front of the Christ image. Doesn't that just give you a sense of depth? There's volume and depth and three-dimensionality there. Now, he still has some funny little conventions, like look behind the woman who has her hand flung up. There's a whole group of heads where it's a kind of a shorthand to say, okay, there's a crowd here. But he's not going to paint individuals. He just paints a bunch of little heads. This comes from medieval art. It's a kind of a shorthand. But the other thing that's so important is that Giotto also brings into his work emotion, human emotion. So he's not only bringing in this realism and three-dimensionality, but look at how the angels are all weeping because Jesus has died. They're all shown in absolute despair and weeping and crying. And so are some of these mourners. Look at the arms of John, the beloved apostle. His arms are flung back in this very dramatic gesture. Look at the woman on the left in green who has her hands clenched by her cheek, and the one next to her who has her hand thrown up. So he's a very dramatic, emotional artist. And this is something, he didn't invent it, but he popularized it, if you will. He gets away from the stoic kind of frozen look of Byzantine art. Other artists begin to adopt things, I think under the influence to some extent, really of Giotto. As I said in my first lecture today, Giotto wasn't universally accepted. There were still very traditional, old-fashioned patrons and artists who preferred to work in the more Byzantine or Gothic style. But it was a growing group of people who appreciated this new, if you will, modern style that resurrected the style of the ancient Romans. And one of those people was Pietro Lorenzetti, who you see an altarpiece by here, whose altarpiece you see here. It's a triptych, and this is another term you all will need to learn. Triptych means three-paneled altarpiece. So tri is three, and that's what this means. Diptych would mean two. Polyptych means multiple panels, and these are things we'll encounter again and again in the Renaissance portion of the course. Well, this is the birth of the Virgin. Remember how I said earlier how there's a birthing scene and there's always someone bathing the infant? Comes from Middle Ages. And so we saw in the Nativity by Pisano, Mary reclining and the baby Jesus being bathed by the nursemaids or midwives or whatever. Here we have Mary's mother, Anne, lying on the birthing bed, and Mary's being bathed in the foreground. So it's kind of an interesting tradition. And in the minds of the viewer, it would make the connection. Because think about who the Virgin Mary was. She was the mother of Jesus, but she did the miraculous thing of having a virgin birth. And she was born without original sin, which was, she's the only human other than Jesus who had no original sin. So there's a parallel being made between her divine son and her special nature as Mary. Look how the work kind of has a tension, I think, between the Gothic past and the classical future, if you will, of the Renaissance. the whole thing has got Gothic pointed frames. And yet the style inside, there's round arches. Can you see the architecture in the background? Those are round arches, not pointed arches. So that harkens back to ancient Rome. The ancient Romans didn't use pointed arches. That was an invention of the Gothic era from about 1300 on, late 1200s. The Romans used the round arch generally. So see how the style, the content is framed in a very Gothic style, but the interior, the content is much more Roman, more classical. And looking back, it's hard to explain how it can be innovative to look back, but that's exactly what the Renaissance was all about. And it's all about context, because they were making the break with the prevailing style that we often call Italo-Byzantine, or the Maniera Greca. And I don't want to get into it too much, but the situation in Italy, I talked about the Maniera Greca, but it was a complex blending of the Byzantine from the East with the Gothic from France coming into Italy as well. So those things kind of melded in Italy. And so you can't call a lot of the Gothic art of Italy pure Byzantine or pure Gothic. It's very often a joining of the two. But it's a very clear distinction when they start bringing in these styles and elements inspired by ancient Rome, because that is a whole new break and it goes against the older traditions. And it's actually kind of funny, because on the left you see through that little gap at the top, I don't know, let me see, is my pointer working? Can you see my cursor? See how
Yes,
there's pointed arches. There's a building in the background, probably meant to be the temple or something, and it's in a Gothic style. Often a Renaissance artist would depict things of his present time, symbolizing the church, the Christian church, in a Roman style, because they are identifying that with modern times and with ancient Rome, which is when Jesus lived. And they contrast it with the Old Testament, and they equate the Old Testament with the Gothic. I mean, knowing perfectly well the Gothic didn't exist in the Old Testament, but it's the old versus the new. You see what I'm saying? So pointed arches often are symbolic of the old temple of ancient Jerusalem. And sometimes that is a deliberate contrast with the more Roman-inspired things of the new order. Because remember, Jesus was born a Jew, and he adhered to Jewish law throughout his life, but he came in effect to supplant the Jewish tradition and start a new tradition. So that's why the dichotomy between the ancient and the new, in this case, they say between the Gothic and the new Roman style of the Renaissance. Does that make any sense? And just to point out, this Gothic stuff I'm talking about is there was a fairly strong taste for not Byzantine per se, or not Italo-Byzantine, but for a French-inspired Gothic style. Because remember, France had strong political, military presence in Italy. They controlled Lombardy, they controlled Milan for many years, and had other possessions in Sicily, for instance, in southern Italy at different times. And so the French Gothic also was a strain that came in and persisted even when some artists began to incorporate these new Roman classical elements. Some patrons and some artists still clung to the old elegant, graceful Gothic style that had come from France. So this is a perfect example here, this wonderful altarpiece, the Saint Ansanus altarpiece by an artist named Simone Martini of about 1333. First of all, look, it's all gold. So it's very much in keeping with the Gothic and the Byzantine for that matter. But look at that elegant angel who has come down, Angel Gabriel of the Annunciation. He's come down to tell Mary that she is the chosen one of God, that she will become the mother of Jesus, the Savior. And look how she's shying away. She's humble and she's overwhelmed by this burden that's being placed on her. But look at the swaying gracefulness both of Mary and of the angel. And look at that wonderful fluttering plaid drapery over here. This is all very, very French Gothic in its style. And it couldn't be really more different, I think, than the Giotto, Lombardi trend, Cavallini trend of bringing more classical solidity and volume. I mean, there's really not much of a sense of volume about this angel or even about the Virgin. In fact, her face to me looks kind of Byzantine in a way. So again, it shows that interesting blending. And just a complete aside, I wanted to point out, I don't know if you can see it. Can you see the inscription here? It's in gold on gold, so it's hard to read, but it says Ave Maria, Gratia Plena. I can't read the whole thing. Tecum. This is actually a very traditional thing coming out of the Middle Ages that they still use in the early Renaissance, where if someone's speaking in a painting, especially sacred scripture, they actually write the words on the painting so that you can read that inscription. So basically, this is the angel Gabriel's text, Hail Mary, full of grace. The Lord is with you, which is the prayer that has come out of this biblical event. But it's actually inscribed right on the painting. So as if the viewer of this altarpiece didn't already know this by heart, it's said right there, which is kind of interesting, I think. We've already addressed this a little bit in terms of the Ghiberti version, but I thought it would be kind of interesting just for this overall summary of the Renaissance. And by the way, we are getting into the Quattrocento here, and I already pointed out how important the Florence Baptistry Doors competition was as a kind of a watershed, a beginning of the Renaissance. And so we have, for instance, brought in here for comparison one of the other entries, the one on the left by Filippo Brunelleschi. Now, there's kind of a funny story about this. I don't know how apocryphal it is. It's probably a kernel of truth in it. Brunelleschi was a much more important figure at the time than Ghiberti. He was a major sculptor and an architect. I think he came into this competition thinking he was just going to win it. And when Ghiberti won it, Brunelleschi was so angry, he said, I'm not going to make sculpture again, ever. So he stopped being a sculptor and became virtually just an architect. And he became a very important architect because, as I said, he did the dome of Florence Cathedral and so on. But it's a kind of an interesting sidelight on the rivalries between artists of the Renaissance era and how the cult of fame becomes an important component of the Renaissance. Throughout most of the Middle Ages, and indeed to some extent antiquity, Roman antiquity, artists were more or less anonymous. They didn't sign their works. They were craftsmen rather than what we today look as at artists. But this begins to change in the Renaissance, where some of these artists, and I think it's an outgrowth of humanism, they begin to claim for themselves a higher status with the support of, some of the humanist scholars and that sort of thing, and the patrons perhaps. And they develop what we call today a cult of fame, where their name becomes as important as their accomplishments. And so, for instance, many people have noted that, in fact, Michelangelo acted almost as his own press agent. He crafted a persona for the public. So did Leonardo. But I think you begin to see that even with Brunelleschi, perhaps. Well, on the right, you see actually the doors as completed. So I mentioned that Ghiberti was awarded the commission for these doors. There's 28 square panels. That's all the detail. Notice that it took him 20 years to finish those doors. Each panel had to be designed, done in clay, a mold made, cast, and then the casting had to be refined. In other words, sanded and polished and fixed, any, rough edges removed. And then it had to be gilded so that all the little figures were gilded. Now, most of these have the gilding gone, but you can see a bit of the gilding over here. So you can see why it took 20 years. And of course, he didn't work alone. He had a workshop. But if you compare the Brunelleschi and the Ghiberti, what do you think are the differences? Do you think the one on the left is stiffer? It doesn't have the graceful swaying figure of the Abraham, the father. Certainly doesn't have that classical nude Isaac. So in some ways, it's a little more backward, if you will. It doesn't have the innovative new approach to composition. I mean, sort of look at the Brunelleschi on the left. The figures are all kind of just spaced out. Very little overlapping. Look at the figures on the Ghiberti, how the donkey and those two figures are kind of in depth. They're overlapped. So in a way, there's more spatial illusion going on. So again, that sort of points towards Ghiberti's great strength. One of the contributions that Brunelleschi made to painting, now he wasn't a painter by any means, was he was fascinated by perspective. And that may have come out of his work as an architect, I don't know. Because he had to make drawings, elevation drawings of the buildings he was designing and so on. But with many scholars, he is credited with having rediscovered linear perspective. Linear perspective is one of those things that the ancient Romans kind of knew how to do, but it seems to have fallen out of the common knowledge during the Middle Ages, and quite possibly because they didn't care about it. It wasn't important to them because so much art in the Middle Ages, as I said earlier, was symbolic. It was all about the other world. It was about heaven. It was about sacred things. So picturing the world as the world actually is was not so important to them. So who needed perspective? But the point is, the Renaissance inquiring minds wanted to sort of resurrect this. And it's something that Alberti tinkered with a bit. But this drawing on the right is a modern reconstruction of a method that Filippo Brunelleschi came up with. And it's very well documented. People wrote about it. It caused quite a stir in Florence. But he made this device with a hole in it and a mirror, and he held up a panel, and he lined it up with the Florence Baptistry, which you see on the left. And so the idea was that you could devise these vanishing lines that were an important component in learning how to paint, again, on a two-dimensional surface, the illusion of a three-dimensional building that occupies space and whose edges recede back to a vanishing point. I always use this tried and true but corny comparison. Think about standing in the middle of a railroad tracks, and those tracks are parallel. They never change the distance between the rails. But where you stand and look at it in the distance, they look like the rails converge. That's a function of human vision, the eyes. And so that is what we see in perspective, is that illusion that at a distance, parallel lines actually look like they converge. And by studying it scientifically, people realized, okay, well, there's a horizon line, there's a vanishing point where those lines come to. And so Brunelleschi made a really important discovery about how that could be done geometrically, mathematically. And so it allowed artists to begin to create the illusion of architectural forms in a two-dimensional medium. So again, we've seen this painting. Again, it shows 3 different episodes in the same story, but not in 3 separate spaces, but all in one unified space. So it's kind of hard to make a comparison. It's almost like time-lapse photography, where a group of figures interacts in the middle. Then one of those figures, Peter, goes off and does something else in the same space, but later in time. And then Peter comes back and he does another thing later, but in the same space. So it's a compilation of images condensed into one space. It's kind of an economy of narration. So I wanted to show you, this is one of the frescoes that comes from the Brancacci Chapel. I think so often we don't, in studying the Renaissance art and other art, we don't really see the works in their original context. We either see them isolated or we see them hanging on a wall in a museum. But in this case, the fresco is still in the chapel and it's been cleaned, I don't know, in the last 15 years or something. It's very bright and clean, as we discussed earlier. But compared to the Giottos that we looked at earlier, the scale of the building is still not quite right, but it's better than in Giotto. The space is more expansive. The mountains are certainly more realistic in scale and they're more convincing. And look at those wonderful forms. Again, Masaccio learned a lesson from Giotto. Look how the tax collector has got his back to us. So we're seeing this volume in the very front, and there's people beyond him. And look how these are individualized. They're not like Giotto, where there's a cluster of heads with no bodies. And these are individualized figures. And so we begin to get the sense of a crowd scene. So you can see that Masaccio, if you will, has learned the lessons of Giotto and has, in some ways, moved beyond them in terms of a realistic depiction of space and volume. Similarly, in sculpture, artists learn these same lessons we've been talking about in terms of layering figures so you get a sense of depth, but also in terms of the linear perspective that I mentioned a moment ago that Brunelleschi was so important in developing. Here's a beautiful little bronze, a gilded bronze panel from this baptismal font you see on the right from Siena Cathedral. The commission was given to Donatello, probably, I'd say arguably the leading Florentine sculptor of the Quattrocento. And if you look at it, it's got a series of episodes going back in space through these archways. And partly the artist conveys the recession of space by the depth of the carving of the figures. See how the figures in the very foreground are deep? They're almost fully round. In fact, some of the heads, like this head of the kneeling servant, is fully round. But then as you get further back, it becomes more of a relief and less of a full round. And then here we begin to get very shallow relief, and then here very shallow, almost just sort of etched. So we have a real sense of recession of space that's done by that, by the arches, look at the floor tiles. The floor tiles are done in linear perspective. So if you trace those lines, they would go back to a vanishing point in the distance. So Donatello became a master of this very early on, and he brought in perspective to his works that were two-dimensional works.
Jim,
Similar,
Jim, I want to tell you, we have 5 minutes to 1 o'clock, and we have 2 hours next class, so you can stop
Right.
whenever you want to stop.
I'm,
Pick up
I'm
next
looking
time.
for I'm looking for a convenient place, so I think it'll be right
Yes.
after this.
Okay.
Because I wanted to wrap up the sculpture. Thank you. Yes, I'm got my eye on the clock. And so the same lessons that Donatello learned are applied by Ghiberti in his second set of doors. I'm sorry, Lily, did you need me to stop so you had some announcements, or can I go right up?
No, I'm fine. It's just, I
Okay.
just want to let you know, there's time
Right.
for next.
Understood. Yeah, totally understood. In this panel for his second set of doors, you know, he was so successful with that first set. But if you think back to the set that was done for the east doors, now I should point out, the baptistry has 3 sets of doors, north, east, and south. There's no doors on the west because that's where the altar is. The east doors are always the most important because they face the door of the cathedral. They're directly across from the main entrance. So that first set of Ghiberti doors was for the east doors. And they were so successful, they were wonderful. But then they wanted to move them to the south doors and commission one more set for the east, and that's this set. And he was given the commission. Notice how he got rid of those little quatrefoil panels. Remember there were 28? Now he's gone to much bigger square panels, and there's only 10. Much more detail in each panel. And look how he's learned the lessons of the dimension of the perspective. And look how he's layered numerous narrative elements from one story into one panel. So this is the story of Jacob and Esau. And so you've got an episode in here. You've got the birth over here, where I don't know if you know the whole story. I'm not going to go into the whole story. There's too much. But the father was blind. The 2 sons, one of them fooled the father by putting his wool sheepskin over his shoulders, because the one who was supposed to inherit was hairy. And so so in a sense, it was about stealing of the inheritance and substitution. There's episodes here, someone going off to go hunting here, a conversation between God and this woman up here. All of these are episodes from the story of Jacob and Esau, but they're all blended into one unified space. And again, like Donatello, Ghiberti here has done a variation of the amount of three-dimensionality to the figures. Some of these figures are virtually completely three-dimensional, and then that changes as you go further back. And eventually, the figures become very low relief. And by the way, these terms are important. Again, French terms. High relief is called haut, H-A-U-T, haut relief. And low relief like these, it's called bas relief, B-A-S, which means low. So if you want to sound educated and erudite, you go haut relief or bas relief. But again, look at the perspective. Look at the floor tiles. All go back to a vanishing point. The same with the architecture up here. They lead back to a vanishing point. So you have a very convincing three-dimensional space. And really, this idea of continuous narrative where all these things are lumped together is very similar to what Masaccio was doing. This was a stock trait of narrative art during the Renaissance. So this is a convenient stopping point. We're going to finish up the Quattrocento and then do the Cinquecento, the High Renaissance, during Monday's class, where we'll bring us up to date for the whole survey of Italian Renaissance art. So we'll pause right there and ask first, are there any questions? Have I left you puzzled and confused? No? Everyone good? Robert has a hand up.
Yeah, I'm just curious, Jim, if you could briefly talk about how they did the casting of that, where some were in a complete round and some were a bas relief.
Yeah, they actually did it in parts. And so some of the fully round or nearly fully round figures were cast separately, and then they would be attached to the panel. That was really the only way they could make it work.
Uh-huh.
Yep. Any other questions? Nope. Okay. Well, thank you for your attention, and hopefully you'll have a wonderful weekend, and you'll pick up your assignments from the training website and be ready to go to town.
Okay, I want the training team stay for just a few minutes. We want to finalize the assignments because of the gallery change. So we want to have probably a couple of minor changes. So thank you, everybody. This was a great first day of class.
May I ask Jenna to hang around 1 second? Can you just hang on for a second? Because you're affected by the gallery change. I just had a question for you.
Thought I was fired.
Audie, Jenna, no.
Hi, everyone.
I don't want to take away from Lily and Michelle and so on, but my question is, are you comfortable with going into the museum before the 20th and looking at the work that's going to be taken down? In other words, do you need to see the work more than once? Because one of your works, the Christ Church Annunciation, will be taken down on the 20th and put in storage. So my point to Michelle and Lily is maybe we don't need to change the assignment list. Would you rather not do that work and have another one given to you?
I haven't seen it, but depends on what it looks like, I guess. I don't know. I don't.
Well, the image will be available. I'm just saying you have how many days? 10 days to go see it. Is that enough?
Is that a Tintoretto? Is that the one?
No.
No. We took the Tintoretto is going to be a report provided.
Who did this work?
We don't know. The master of the Christ Church Annunciation. He's an anonymous early painter.
Okay. I guess.
Well, I don't want to make a decision. It's if you feel it's more.
I'll take another one. I'll go with door number 3.
I was
Okay,
just
so Jenna,
it's possible. So go ahead. You can leave, everyone. Everyone can leave.
Okay.
We just want the training team.
Training has to caucus figure out.
Bye-bye. Have a good week.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just trying to save us some trouble, but that's okay. If she prefers, and that's probably wise, but I was going to say it's going to be up for 9 days if that's enough.
well, it would be nice to have the report because I don't think we've had a report on that one for a while, but.
Right.
Then maybe we should, I guess she was saying she would rather change, but what would she change to? So let's look at what, there are 2 different things. One is what the trainee wants to do. Another thing is we're trying to get more reports that are not available very much. That's why we're trying to get them to assign to certain works.
Well, if we were going to take that one away and give her one that's actually hanging, there's not a lot of choice for Renaissance because that's a Renaissance work. So her other work is a Northern Renaissance work, the 2 portraits, and then the Baroque Queen Henrietta. So she needs a Renaissance. The only Renaissance works that are hanging that haven't been assigned are either loans or there's the, what did I find? Oh, the Bugiardini, which we have other reports on.
Yeah, it's a good,
but that would be one that.
It's a good painting, but you said we just had a recent report on it. And is the Bonsi a problem or are we okay?
The Bonsi was okay because that person, okay, I have to remember who had it. That was
Kate.
Is Kay, and she also
Kate.
has.
She has Giorgione.
Okay.
Yeah, Giorgione and Sanchez Coton. So she's got 2 of her three are up. So
Are on display, yeah. So
Right.
she's
Yeah.
okay. So I guess Gina is the one. What did
Yeah.
you change to from Tintoretto?
the Tintoretto, trying to remember now. Well, I guess I gave her, oh, I know. I took the Tintoretto away. It's not hanging. And so that's when I gave her the Christchurch coronation because it's up.
Oh.
But it's, yeah.
So what
only up
are the
for-
other ones Gina has? She has
She has the Brew
carnation.
portrait of
Oh,
the young
the-
man
yeah,
along with
yeah.
the Broyne
Yeah,
lady
yes,
with the
okay.
carnation.
And then
So we could take that.
She
Baroque, I'm
doesn't
thinking
really-
her Baroque. Oh, then
She really needs an
doesn't have a
Italian.
religious Renaissance one, which is kind of strange. She has a portrait and she has the wedding pictures of German or whatever they are, but she doesn't have like an Italian or a Spanish more typical Renaissance religious painting.
Which is, yeah, why I gave her
Well,
that.
this is partly-
Which is a necessity, but it's a big hole.
This is partly why I was trying to arrange it to let her do it in the next 9 days, but if she doesn't want to, maybe
I
she
don't
would
think she
reconsider.
knows. I don't think she knows what the other options are. So maybe this is still the
I think
best.
she was thinking about maybe what it looks like if she likes it or not. That's the impression I got. Because she said something about, well, I don't know what it looks like.
Well, can we send her the image and have her think about it?
Yeah, we don't.
Yeah, I agree. I think she may like it anyway.
Yeah, and we can.
Well, we
put
haven't
out-
really given anybody else the choice of whether or not they like what they've been assigned, but yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That's true, but no one else has been thrown a curveball of having their painting
Yeah, it's true.
taken.
Yeah.
Could we give her something else that's not up? Or,
No, the whole point is that she has to see something.
oh, she needs to see
Fair.
something.
None
be
of hers are up,
Each person,
Giorgione's up, isn't he?
oh, the
but he's
brew.
been
Oh,
assigned to
yeah.
someone else.
Oh,
That's true.
We could take away the marriage portraits. I mean, the whole point is just to give her one that's up. If we took out the marriage portraits and gave her a different Northern Renaissance or something like that, that's the other choice.
Sorry,
I'm not sure what we have.
I have no solution for you.
We would like to give her one that she could look at. Right?
well, but tell her we could tell her that we tried and there really isn't one available. So if we think she should do that one.
I agree. She really doesn't know. So this one goes away in 10 days. It may still be the best choice. So she doesn't really know what it looks like. So I don't think she.
Neither do I. I can't picture which.
I don't
one.
remember either. What does it look like?
That's what I was
It's a
trying
Yeah,
to
it's a
think.
triptych.
A little
Oh,
triptych
okay,
with a
sure.
pointy
Yeah, I know.
top,
That is
Oh,
wonderful.
that small triptych.
very
Yeah.
small.
Yeah.
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 Oh,
Yes, that one is really nice.
I think it's a very meaty subject. There's a lot you can talk about,
yeah.
and it's a good example of a very early.
Yeah, I think we should. Yeah, let's give her that. I think that's a nice one. That's a good one.
Just tell her.
Well, the other option, like I said, would be if we swapped out the marriage portraits. I think we have a lot of reports on those and gave her a different Northern Renaissance, but I'm not actually I'm saying that, but I don't know what's up there. I don't think there's anything up. So scratch that.
Yeah, we haven't.
There's really not so much up because that whole room is gone, you know.
That's right. A lot were removed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
True.
we just give her that triptych, and we'll give her a picture, and I think that's a nice one.
Say that we tried. We went through all the options and there wasn't a better one.
That's right. I agree. I think that's a good one. Let's just give her that one. And anything else? I don't remember what else did you change because I already used the old list, gave the report name. I don't think
much was changed. Jim had pointed out the error that I made on the accession number and I fixed that. That's what I sent you today, but I haven't.
Yeah, I
I mean,
think that
the
doesn't impact the file name. My file. And can we just look at Vanita? I think we just changed the due dates, right? Her works are the same. Vanita.
Right. Right. All hers. Yeah, she's got the Crivelli, the Eisenbrandt.
Eisenberg, yeah, okay. So then I think the report names are fine. So it's just Gina. Then I think we're fine. Let's just give her the triptych. I think that's a nice one. Once she looks at it, she will fall in love with it. There's just so many stories to tell.
And
there's
she
just a
gets
lot
to
to
tell everybody what a triptych is.
Yes, yes. Okay.
Are we all worried that Richard didn't show up? Are we gonna contact him? And
Now I'm thinking, I think he sent me an email a while ago. I just thought about that now. That's right, he cannot make it. I completely forgot. He sent me an email.
just today, you mean?
No, several days ago. That's why I
He needs the
forgot.
class, Lily.
And he asked if we make a recording so he could review it later.
Oops, I just realized I'm still recording.
We're still.
I always forget to turn it off.
They turn it off.
Add it onto your lecture.
Can
David.
you